Somewhere in the frozen silence of the Ice Age, survival stopped being about strength and started becoming about strategy. Early humans were not just chasing animals anymore, they were learning how to control where those animals would go without ever touching them. A hidden pit in the ground, a narrow frozen valley, a path that looked natural and it wasn't. This is the story of how the first hunting trap was born, not in a single moment, but through thousands of years of observation, failure, and survival pressure. Before we go deeper into this forgotten turning point in human history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more journeys into the mysteries of our ancient past. Because once humans learned to trap animals, they were never just hunters again. A wind moves across the Ice Age steppe like something alive, sweeping over frozen grasslands that stretch farther than sight can measure. It carries fine lead dust from distant glaciers and presses it into the lungs of anyone exposed too long. In this landscape, nothing stays soft for long. Even sound feels frozen, breaking into sharp fragments before it disappears into the white distance. Herds of animals move like shadows between snowfields, and the humans who follow them are smaller than the vastness around them, always calculating, always hungry. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, food is never guaranteed here. That is the first truth that shapes everything else. Early human groups live within a rhythm dictated not by comfort or habit, but by scarcity. A successful hunt does not mean abundance. It only means survival has been extended by a few days. When the hunt fails, there is no alternative supply waiting in storage. The land offers what it offers, and then it takes it away without warning. At the edge of a half-frozen river, a small group watches the movement of reindeer as they cross in tight formations. The animals are strong, fast, and unpredictable, and they carry enough weight in meat and fat to sustain an entire group through the hardest weeks of winter. But reaching them is another matter entirely. The hunters crouch low, wrapped in layered animal skins, their breath forming brief clouds that vanish immediately into the cold air. Every decision they make carries consequence, because failure does not simply mean disappointment, it means starvation slowly tightening its grip. Ice Age survival is shaped by repetition. The same routes are followed year after year, the same hunting grounds are returned to even when they begin to fail. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that early humans are highly adaptive, yet deeply constrained by the limits of direct confrontation with large prey. Scholars still debate how often successful kills actually occurred, but the general picture remains consistent. Hunting large animals at close range is dangerous, inefficient, and often unsuccessful. A sudden movement breaks the stillness. The herd shifts direction. One misstep in timing, one missed opportunity, and the moment is gone. The hunters do not chase immediately. Experience has already taught them that pursuit across open frozen ground drains energy faster than it produces reward. Instead, they remain still, watching, learning. In this frozen world, patience is not a virtue, it is a requirement for survival. Days earlier, the group had returned from a failed hunt. The details are not recorded anywhere, but traces of such failures are visible in the broader archaeological pattern, bones showing irregular butchery marks, seasonal nutritional stress in skeletal remains, and evidence of repeated malnutrition cycles. Something is not working consistently in the way food is obtained. The land still provides animals, but access to them is becoming increasingly difficult as climates shift and herd patterns change. Hunger does not arrive suddenly in this environment. It builds quietly. A child eats less, an elder conserves strength. Even the strongest hunters begin to feel the weight of missed opportunities. In these conditions, the mind starts to change. It looks for patterns more aggressively. It remembers failures more vividly than successes, and slowly, it begins to consider possibilities that would not emerge in times of abundance. One of those possibilities begins not as invention, but as observation. Across a shallow valley, where wind has carved uneven depressions into the frozen soil, animals occasionally vanish from sight. Not through magic or mystery, but through terrain irregularities hidden beneath snow. A bison steps forward and disappears into a shallow pit softened by thaw and refreeze. It struggles, unable to regain footing quickly. By the time it escapes, if it escapes at all, predators have already noticed. The humans watch this from a distance, their attention sharpening. At first, it is just an event, something that happens without meaning, but repetition begins to give it weight. Similar incidents occur in different places: mud traps in thawing seasons, narrow ravines where animals lose momentum, fallen trees that redirect movement into confined spaces. Each of these moments becomes a silent lesson. Early humans are not passive observers, they are learners under pressure. The Ice Age environment forces a kind of attention that modern life rarely demands. Nothing is ignored. Everything is evaluated for potential use. The idea that landscape itself can participate in hunting begins to form slowly, not as theory, but as memory. Yet survival is still dominated by direct pursuit, spears, stones, coordinated chasing across dangerous terrain. Every hunt is a gamble, and every gamble risks injury, which in this world is often as deadly as hunger. A broken leg does not heal easily when mobility determines access to food and safety. The cost of failure is cumulative, and it shapes behavior in subtle but persistent ways. As winters grow harsher in some regions, groups begin shifting their seasonal movements more aggressively. They follow herds further, stay longer in favorable zones, and abandon traditional grounds when they no longer produce results. This mobility increases survival, but also increases uncertainty. A missed migration route can separate a group from its food source entirely. In this fragile balance, something crucial begins to emerge. The recognition that waiting for animals to present themselves is not enough. The environment itself must be influenced, not controlled in the modern sense, but subtly guided, nudged, shaped through human action. No single moment marks the invention of the first trap. There is no clear line where observation becomes intention. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of understanding, built on countless small failures and rare successes. The Ice Age does not allow sudden brilliance without consequence. Every innovation must survive the test of hunger. And so, in the cold silence between hunts, where exhaustion and necessity overlap, the earliest foundations of a new strategy begin to form. Not yet engineering, not yet design, but the first recognition that survival might depend not only on strength or speed, but on foresight. A shift is beginning, hidden beneath the surface of daily struggle, waiting for its first deliberate expression. The failed hunts do not end with the chase. They end much later, when silence returns and the group gathers around what little can be shared. Meat is divided unevenly not by status, but by necessity. Those who ran the furthest, those who were injured, those too young or too old to participate in the pursuit, all depend on the outcome of a single coordinated effort. When that effort fails, the consequences spread quietly through every body present. In the Ice Age world, failure is rarely dramatic. It is slow, cumulative, and deeply physical. Muscle strength weakens after repeated shortages. Focus becomes harder to maintain. Even simple decisions take longer, as the brain conserves energy in response to reduced intake. Archaeological studies of ancient skeletal remains suggest recurring patterns of stress fractures, dental wear from tough raw diets, and seasonal malnutrition. These are not isolated incidents, but reflections of a life constantly balanced on the edge of insufficiency. What makes direct hunting especially fragile is its unpredictability. A group may track a herd for days only to lose it in a sudden snow shift. Wind can erase tracks overnight. Animals can change direction without warning, responding to subtle environmental cues that humans cannot fully interpret. The hunters know this. They experience it repeatedly. And with each failure, the same question grows stronger: is there a way to remove chance from the encounter? The answer does not arrive as theory, it arrives as observation. In one remembered instance passed down through countless generations of similar experiences, a wounded animal breaks away from a herd and stumbles into a narrow depression between rock formations. It does not die immediately. It struggles, trapped by its own weight and the shape of the ground. The hunters arrive later, not because they pursued it successfully, but because they followed the movement of the herd and noticed its absence. Such moments are rare, but they linger in memory more than successful chases. Success in direct hunting feels expected. Failure feels normal. But an animal trapped by the landscape itself introduces something different. The environment becomes an active participant in survival. Early humans do not yet have a language for engineering, but they understand modification. They move stones to create windbreaks. They rearrange branches to mark paths. They alter their surroundings in small ways that accumulate meaning over time. None of these actions are initially intended as hunting innovations, yet they establish a mental framework in which the environment is not fixed. Across different Ice Age regions, similar patterns emerge in Eurasian steppe zones, in parts of prehistoric Europe, and in scattered open landscapes shaped by glacial retreat. Animals repeatedly encounter natural features that hinder movement. Deep snow pockets slow large bodies. Ice crusts break under weight. Hidden ravines become temporary traps. These are not engineered structures, but they demonstrate a principle: motion can be disrupted. The human mind begins to register this principle with increasing clarity. What separates humans from other predators in this context is not physical strength, but anticipation. Wolves, bears, and other Ice Age predators rely on proximity, speed, and instinct. Humans begin to rely on prediction. They watch herds not only for movement, but for hesitation. They study the way animals react to uneven terrain, how fear causes sudden shifts in direction, how group cohesion breaks under stress. This is where the earliest conceptual foundation of trapping begins to form, not in construction, but in understanding behavior. At some point, a critical realization occurs across multiple groups independently if animals can be guided toward disadvantageous terrain. Then hunting no longer requires constant pursuit. Instead, it can be structured around anticipation of movement. This idea changes everything, but it does not yet become a system. It remains fragmented. A memory of a herd panicking into a narrow valley. A successful kill that required less effort because the environment did most of the work. A fallen animal that could not escape a natural depression. Each of these events is stored not as isolated incidents, but as patterns waiting to be connected. The Ice Age environment itself encourages this kind of thinking. Open landscapes force visibility. There are few places for animals to hide completely. Instead, Survival depends on distance, timing, and geography. Every ridge, every slope, every frozen stream bed becomes part of a mental map that humans carry and refine over time. Yet there is still a barrier between observation and invention. Seeing a trap-like event in nature is not the same as creating one intentionally. That leap requires not just memory, but imagination applied to physical space. Evidence for this transition is indirect, but compelling. Archaeologists studying early human sites sometimes find unusual arrangements of stones and pits that do not align with natural formations. Some are too regular in shape. Others appear positioned in ways that would influence animal movement. However, preservation is rare, and time has erased most traces of perishable materials that may have been part of early structures. Because of this, scholars still debate the timeline of intentional trapping. Some argue that fully deliberate traps appear later, with more advanced cognitive and social development. Others suggest that the earliest forms likely emerged far earlier than the material record can confirm, simply because organic materials like wood, hides, and rope do not survive in most climates. What remains consistent across interpretations is the pressure that drives innovation. Survival does not allow stagnation. Groups that fail to adapt to changing herd patterns or climate shifts disappear from the record entirely. Those that persist show signs of increasing sophistication in resource use, including more efficient butchery, coordinated hunting strategies, and eventual environmental manipulation. In this context, the idea of turning terrain into an advantage becomes less like invention and more like inevitability. Still, the earliest attempts are likely inconsistent and experimental. A shallow pit dug without certainty, a narrow corridor partially blocked with stones, a snow-covered depression used opportunistically rather than systematically. Many of these efforts would fail. Animals would avoid altered terrain, structures would collapse, efforts would be abandoned. But even failure carries value in such an environment. Each attempt refines understanding. Each mistake teaches what animals will not accept, how they respond to obstruction, how they adapt to pressure. Over time, this feedback loop strengthens cognitive models of behavior, and somewhere within this slow accumulation of knowledge, the boundary between accident and intention begins to blur. What started as observation of natural traps begins to shift toward controlled imitation, not yet true engineering, but something approaching it, a recognition that if nature can capture, then humans might be able to replicate the conditions under which capture occurs. It is in this fragile space between understanding and action that the first real foundations of trapping begin to form. The landscape does not change quickly in Ice Age environments, but human perception of it does. What once looked like empty frozen ground begins to reveal structure under sustained observation. Slopes are no longer just slopes. They become channels of movement. Valleys are no longer just depressions. They become funnels through which entire herds pass under predictable pressure. Even wind-carved snowdrifts begin to matter, because they influence where animals step and where they hesitate. This shift in perception is not sudden. It develops through repeated exposure to failure and near success. A herd turns too sharply and escapes. Another group of animals is slowed by soft ground and narrowly avoided by predators. In each case, survival hinges on small variations in terrain and timing. Early humans, forced to live inside this uncertainty, begin to treat the environment as something readable. What emerges is not yet engineering, but a kind of environmental literacy. Hunting groups start returning to the same locations with increasing awareness of how geography shapes outcomes. A narrow pass becomes more valuable than an open plain. A bend in a valley becomes more important than the herd itself. because it determines whether an encounter will be chaotic or controlled. This is the beginning of spatial thinking applied to survival. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites does not preserve these mental shifts directly, but it does show subtle changes in behavior. Tool assemblages become more standardized. Hunting remains show patterns of selection rather than random scavenging. Animal bones are often found in locations that suggest repeated processing sites rather than single-event kills. These patterns indicate planning, coordination, and return usage of specific landscape zones. At the same time, animals themselves are not static targets. They adapt constantly. Prey species like bison, reindeer, and wild horses develop heightened sensitivity to human presence. They learn to avoid certain areas, especially those where ambushes are more likely. This creates a feedback loop between predator and prey, where each side continuously adjusts to the other's strategies. It is within this dynamic relationship that the first true insight into trapping behavior takes shape. Humans begin to notice that animals rarely move randomly. Even when frightened, their movement follows predictable constraints. They avoid steep slopes when running downhill. They cluster when threatened. They prefer open paths over obstructed ones. These behaviors, shaped by survival instincts, create exploitable patterns. The idea slowly forms that instead of chasing animals directly, one might influence the choices they make before the chase even begins. This is a profound cognitive shift. It moves hunting from reaction to premeditation, from force to guidance, from pursuit to anticipation. The earliest expressions of this thinking are subtle. A group might place obstacles in a narrow corridor of terrain, not to fully block movement, but to slow it. A line of stones might be arranged in a shallow arc to guide animals toward a particular passage. These are not yet formal traps. They are experiments in directing flow. Whether these early modifications were intentional in the modern sense is still debated. Some archaeologists argue that many such arrangements could be coincidental or result from later environmental processes. Others point to repeated patterns across different regions as evidence of deliberate design. The truth likely lies in a gradual transition where intention and imitation of natural forms overlap. What is clear, however, is that humans begin to act with increasing awareness of cause and effect in spatial terms. One of the most significant realizations involves containment. In direct hunting, success depends on closing distance. In early trapping logic, success depends on limiting escape options. This distinction changes the entire structure of hunting strategy. Instead of focusing on speed, humans begin to focus on boundaries. Even rudimentary attempts at shaping movement require cooperation. A single individual cannot reliably guide a herd. Multiple people must position themselves at different points in the landscape, anticipating animal reactions and closing off potential exits. This introduces a new layer of social coordination that goes beyond simple group hunting. Communication becomes more structured. Signals must be understood without sound carrying far in open terrain. Hand gestures, body positioning, and pre-agreed movement patterns begin to develop greater importance. Although no direct record exists of these systems, the complexity of later coordinated hunting strategies suggests that such communication frameworks evolved gradually over long periods. At this stage, environmental manipulation remains fragile. A poorly placed obstacle can cause a herd to scatter unpredictably. Too much interference can make animals avoid the area entirely. Early humans must learn a delicate balance between influence and concealment. The goal is not to alarm prey, but to subtly guide it. In some regions, natural geography assists this process. River valleys act as corridors. Cliffs and rock formations limit escape routes. Seasonal snow accumulation alters terrain in ways that temporarily favor certain pathways. Humans learn to identify and return to these naturally advantageous zones. Over time, these locations become part of shared knowledge within groups, not written or formally recorded, but remembered through repeated use. Certain valleys are known as places where animals can be intercepted. Certain slopes are avoided during specific seasons. This accumulation of environmental memory represents one of the earliest forms of landscape-based strategy. What makes this development so significant is that it represents the beginning of indirect control over survival resources. Rather than relying solely on immediate physical ability, early humans begin to shape outcomes before confrontation occurs. This reduces risk, conserves energy, and increases efficiency when successful. Even partial success in these methods offers a significant advantage over pure pursuit. Still, there is resistance from the environment itself. Not all attempts to manipulate animal movement succeed. Weather can erase carefully prepared features overnight. Snowfall can obscure paths. Rain and thaw cycles can collapse shallow structures or soften terrain unpredictably. In this sense, early trapping concepts remain highly unstable. Yet instability does not prevent persistence. If anything, it encourages refinement. Each failure reveals new constraints. Each success, however small, confirms the underlying principle movement can be influenced. And once that principle is accepted, even partially, the direction of innovation changes permanently. What begins as scattered attempts to shape animal movement slowly converges toward more deliberate construction. The idea that the land can be prepared in advance for a future encounter becomes increasingly central. Hunting is no longer just an event, it becomes a process extended across time. The seeds of the first true hunting traps are now in place, waiting for conditions that will push them from improvisation into design. The first time a natural depression holds an animal long enough for humans to arrive, it does not feel like invention. It feels like interruption, as if the normal order of hunting has briefly revealed a hidden possibility. The animal is not killed by speed or strength, but by the failure of the ground beneath it to behave as expected. Ice has softened, soil has collapsed, and the landscape has momentarily betrayed its own stability. Early humans witnessed these moments the way they witness storms or shifting herds, as events that belong to the world rather than to human intention. Yet something changes in how these events are remembered. A fallen animal trapped in mud or snow is not just a lucky coincidence. It becomes a reference point, a mental image returned to during later hunts when nothing else seems to work. In Ice Age survival, memory is not passive storage. It is a tool shaped by necessity. Groups recall where animals previously struggled, where terrain behaved unpredictably, where movement slowed or failed entirely. Over time, these remembered locations begin to form an informal map of opportunity. The difference between chance and design begins to blur at exactly this point. A shallow pit that once trapped a reindeer is no longer just a pit. It becomes a feature that can be revisited, perhaps even enhanced. A narrow ravine where animals previously hesitated is no longer just geography. It becomes a corridor worth exploiting. The landscape, once seen as neutral, begins to acquire function. What emerges is the earliest foundation of deliberate trapping behavior, the recognition that certain configurations of terrain can be preserved, repeated, or slightly modified to increase the probability of capture. There is no sudden leap into engineering. Instead, there is experimentation driven by scarcity. Groups in harsher environments, where hunting success is less reliable, begin to test small modifications, a deeper hole dug into soft ground, a covering of brush placed over unstable soil. stones arranged to subtly narrow a passage. These actions are simple, but their implications are profound. For the first time, humans are not only reacting to animal movement but preparing for it in advance. The archaeological record offers only faint traces of this transition. Organic materials decay quickly in most Ice Age environments, leaving behind little direct evidence of early trap construction. What survives are indirect indicators, unusual soil disturbances, clusters of bones in confined areas, and repeated use of specific kill sites that suggest some form of environmental guidance. Some sites show concentrations of animal remains in depressions that appear too regular to be entirely natural. Others show evidence of repeated excavation and refilling, suggesting that certain locations were revisited over time. Scholars still debate how much of this reflects intentional trapping versus opportunistic use of natural terrain, but the patterns are difficult to ignore. Even without full certainty, the behavioral trajectory is clear. As groups experiment with modifying terrain, they begin to understand a crucial limitation. Animals do not enter dangerous areas blindly. They assess risk, even if instinctively. This means that successful trapping requires more than just creating a hazard. It requires shaping perception. A pit alone is not enough. It must be hidden. A barrier alone is not enough. It must guide without alarming. The effectiveness of early traps depends not on strength, but on subtlety. This introduces a new layer of cognitive complexity. Humans must imagine how animals perceive the environment. They must predict not just movement, but hesitation, fear, and avoidance. This kind of thinking represents a significant shift from direct pursuit strategies. In some regions, this leads to the emergence of funnel-like hunting zones. Natural valleys are enhanced with human-made adjustments. Branches and stones are used to narrow wide areas into controlled passages. Animals moving through these spaces are not forcibly captured, but gently guided into positions where escape becomes less likely. It is important to emphasize that these early systems are not reliable machines. They are fragile, dependent on weather, animal behavior, and precise placement. A shift in wind direction or a change in herd pattern can render an entire setup ineffective. Yet even partial success provides enough reward to justify continued experimentation. One successful capture using modified terrain can feed a group for days. That level of return on effort, even if inconsistent, is transformative in a world where energy expenditure must be carefully balanced against survival gain. Over time, knowledge accumulates. Groups remember which terrain modifications worked and which failed. They refine their understanding of spacing, concealment, and timing. Younger members observe and replicate these strategies, gradually embedding them into cultural practice. What begins as isolated experimentation slowly becomes shared knowledge. There is also an emerging awareness of effort distribution. Unlike direct hunting, which requires continuous physical exertion during pursuit, trapping allows effort to be front-loaded. Work is done before the animals arrive. This shift in timing is subtle but revolutionary. It allows humans to decouple preparation from immediate action, extending their influence across longer periods. Still, the system is not stable. Early traps are vulnerable to environmental disruption. Heavy snowfall can collapse structures. Rain and thaw cycles can erase carefully prepared terrain. Animals may avoid altered areas entirely if changes are too obvious. The success of trapping depends on maintaining a delicate balance between alteration and natural appearance. This tension drives further refinement. Humans begin to favor less invasive modifications. Instead of large structural changes, they focus on smaller, more strategic adjustments. A partially concealed drop, a subtle narrowing of a path, a cluster of obstacles placed just enough to influence movement without triggering avoidance behavior. These refinements mark a critical turning point in cognitive development. They reflect an increasing ability to model cause and effect not only in physical terms, but in behavioral terms. The landscape is no longer just terrain, it becomes a system of responses. And within that system, the first true principles of trapping begin to solidify. There is a moment in the development of early trapping logic when observation stops being passive and begins to carry expectation. Hunters no longer look at the landscape only for where animals have been. They start to look for where animals will be forced to go. This shift is subtle, almost invisible in daily life, but it changes the entire structure of survival thinking. In the Ice Age world, expectation is dangerous. It can lead to wasted energy, failed hunts, and exposure to harsh conditions. Yet expectation is also necessary for progress. Without it, humans would remain bound to immediate reaction, always responding too late to what the environment has already decided. What emerges here is a new kind of reasoning built on probability rather than certainty. Early humans cannot calculate probability in a mathematical sense, but they can recognize repeated outcomes. They remember that herds moving along river valleys tend to follow the same bends. They notice that frightened animals rarely return through the same narrow passage twice in a short time. These patterns become the foundation for predictive thinking. And prediction is what transforms trapping from accident into intention. Instead of waiting for terrain to capture animals, humans begin to prepare terrain in anticipation of animal movement. This preparation is still minimal, often indistinguishable from natural features unless closely examined. A line of stones placed along a slope that subtly narrows a path. A shallow depression deepened slightly in a spot where animals are known to hesitate. A thicket partially cleared to encourage movement toward a single exit route. None of these actions guarantee success, but they increase the likelihood that movement will unfold in a desired direction. This is the earliest form of environmental design. Archaeological interpretation of such behavior is challenging. Stone arrangements can be affected by geological processes. Soil disturbances can occur naturally through erosion, frost action, or animal activity. As a result, scholars must rely on indirect reasoning rather than definitive proof. However, when multiple indicators appear together, repeated site usage, concentrated animal remains, and consistent terrain modification patterns, the possibility of intentional design becomes stronger. Even so, no single site fully confirms the existence of fully engineered traps in the earlier stages. What survives is a mosaic of partial evidence that suggests a gradual progression rather than a sudden invention. One of the most important developments in this phase is the refinement of guiding structures. Early humans begin to understand that animals are highly sensitive to spatial pressure. Wide open areas feel safe to prey species, while narrowing spaces increase stress and reduce escape options. By manipulating this perception, humans can influence movement without direct confrontation. This insight likely emerges from repeated failures as much as successes. A herd that avoids an obvious obstacle teaches as much as one that is successfully redirected. Over time, groups learn that overt structures are less effective than subtle ones. The most successful early modifications are therefore those that blend into the environment. Branches placed in natural alignments rather than artificial walls, stones arranged in irregular patterns that mimic natural scatter, paths gently reinforced rather than forcibly blocked. The goal is not to impose control but to guide existing tendencies. This reflects a deeper cognitive shift, understanding that influence works best when it aligns with natural behavior rather than opposing it. At the same time, cooperation becomes increasingly essential. A single individual cannot control multiple escape routes. Early trapping systems require coordinated positioning across space. One group may drive animals from a distance, while another group waits in a concealed location. Even if the trap itself is simple, its effectiveness depends on timing and communication. This introduces new forms of social organization. Groups must anticipate not only animal behavior but also each other's movements. Misalignment leads to failure. Too early a drive, and animals escape. Too late, and the opportunity is lost. These pressures encourage the development of more reliable coordination methods, even if informal and non-verbal. In this context, trapping is not just a technological shift, it is a social one. The landscape itself becomes a shared project. Certain areas are prepared collectively, revisited repeatedly, and modified over time. These locations gain significance not just as hunting grounds, but as coordinated systems of survival effort. Some of these sites may have been used seasonally, depending on migration patterns. Others may have been adjusted gradually over years or generations. While direct archaeological evidence for long-term trap maintenance is limited, patterns of repeated human activity in specific zones suggest that some locations held sustained importance. There is also an emerging awareness of risk distribution. Direct hunting concentrates danger in a single moment of confrontation. Trapping spreads risk over time, allowing humans to reduce exposure during the actual capture phase. However, it introduces new risks during construction and maintenance, particularly when working in exposed terrain or near animal pathways. This trade-off reflects an increasingly strategic approach to survival. Not all groups adapt equally. Some rely primarily on traditional pursuit hunting. Others begin experimenting more heavily with environmental manipulation. In regions where climate conditions are harsher or prey more elusive, the incentive to innovate is stronger. This uneven adoption likely contributes to regional variation in early trapping techniques. Another important factor is learning transmission. Unlike tool making, which can be observed directly, trapping strategies often involve spatial reasoning that is harder to convey without repeated demonstration. This suggests that knowledge transfer would have been gradual, relying on shared experience rather than formal instruction. Despite these limitations, the overall trajectory is clear. Humans are increasingly shaping the conditions under which hunting occurs, rather than simply participating in it. The environment is no longer a backdrop to survival. It is becoming an active component of strategy. And once that idea takes root, even in its earliest form, it opens a path toward far more complex systems of control in the future. The ground chosen for the earliest deliberate pits is never random, even when it appears so at first glance. Early humans do not yet reshape entire landscapes, but they learn to recognize where the land already contains weakness, soft soil after seasonal thaw, hidden hollows beneath snow, and narrow animal crossings become preferred locations for experimentation. These are places where nature itself is already close to collapse, where only a small intervention is needed to tip balance into failure. What begins as observation now turns into physical action. The first pits are simple depressions, dug with bone tools, sharpened sticks, and crude stone implements. There is no standard depth, no fixed shape. Each attempt is a response to local conditions. In some cases, the pit is shallow and ineffective. In others, it collapses too quickly or becomes visible to animals before it can be used. Failure is not rare, it is expected. Yet even failed pits contribute to knowledge. A partially successful trap teaches more than a successful hunt ever could. It reveals how animals react when ground stability changes. It shows whether prey species avoid suspicious terrain or test it cautiously. It demonstrates how weight distribution affects collapse. These observations accumulate slowly, becoming the foundation for more refined designs. In some regions, natural pits already exist due to erosion or permafrost instability. Early humans learned to enhance these features rather than create them from scratch. They deepen existing depressions, extend weak edges, and disguise openings with vegetation or snow cover. This marks an important transition from creating traps entirely through effort to cooperating with natural weaknesses in the environment. The idea is simple but powerful. Let nature do part of the work. One of the most significant improvements in early trap design is concealment. Animals in Ice Age environments are highly sensitive to visual irregularities. A freshly dug hole with exposed edges is often avoided. To counter this, humans begin experimenting with surface camouflage. Branches are laid across openings. Snow is packed unevenly to disguise depth changes. Grass or reeds are placed in ways that mimic undisturbed ground. These methods are not perfect. In many cases, wind or shifting weather quickly reveals the trap, but even partial concealment increases success rates enough to justify continued use. At the same time, early humans begin to understand something crucial about animal psychology. Fear is not uniform. Different species react differently to environmental disruption. Large herd animals may hesitate briefly before testing unknown terrain. Smaller animals might avoid it entirely. Predators may be more cautious, relying on scent rather than sight. This variability forces humans to adapt trap design depending on target species. There is no universal trap, only context-dependent strategies. This realization drives further experimentation. Some groups begin to shape approach routes more deliberately. Instead of relying solely on pits, they create guiding corridors using natural barriers like rocks, fallen trees, or dense brush. These structures do not force animals forward. They limit alternatives, gently narrowing the range of possible movement. In effect, early trapping systems begin to resemble simple networks of influence across space. Archaeological interpretation of these early systems is difficult because they rarely leave clear, permanent structures. Organic materials decay. Soil disturbances blend back into natural formations. What remains are indirect signatures, clusters of bones in constrained areas, repeated use of certain terrain features, and patterns of human activity that suggest intentional return to specific locations. Some sites show evidence of repeated digging in similar spots over time, implying that early humans remembered successful or partially successful trap locations and reused them. This kind of behavioral repetition is significant. It suggests not just invention, but memory-based optimization. However, not all innovations succeed. Many early traps likely failed repeatedly before being abandoned. Some may have been too visible. Others may have collapsed prematurely or failed to attract animals into the intended zone. In some cases, animals may have learned to avoid manipulated terrain entirely, forcing humans to continuously adjust their methods. This dynamic creates a subtle evolutionary pressure between human innovation and animal adaptation. As traps become more sophisticated, prey species become more cautious. As animals become more sensitive to irregular terrain, humans refine concealment techniques. It is not a one-sided progression, but a co-evolutionary process. Another important development during this phase is the increasing importance of group specialization. Even in small communities, roles begin to diversify. Some individuals focus on preparing terrain, others monitor animal movement, others remain positioned for final capture or dispatch. This division of the labor increases efficiency, but also requires greater coordination and trust. Such coordination is fragile in early societies. Miscommunication or mistiming can ruin an entire effort. Yet repeated practice gradually improves synchronization. Over time, these coordinated behaviors become embedded in group routines, passed down through observation and imitation. The psychological impact of trapping should not be underestimated. Unlike direct hunting, which involves immediate confrontation, trapping introduces delay between action and outcome. Humans invest effort in preparation without knowing whether it will succeed. This uncertainty changes the emotional rhythm of survival. Anticipation replaces immediate reaction. Waiting becomes part of the hunting process. This temporal shift is subtle but transformative. It extends human influence beyond the moment of action into future time. In doing so, it lays early groundwork for planning as a survival strategy. Environmental conditions continue to play a critical role. Seasonal changes can either enhance or destroy trap effectiveness. Snowfall may hide carefully constructed pits or, conversely, improve concealment. Thaw cycles may collapse structures, but also create new natural traps. Humans learn to time their activities according to these cycles, aligning construction and use with environmental rhythms. In this sense, early trapping systems are not static technologies. They are adaptive processes embedded in seasonal landscapes. By the end of this phase, the idea of manipulating terrain for hunting is no longer experimental. It has become a recurring strategy, refined through failure, improved through observation, and sustained through necessity. The foundation is now firmly established. What remains is the transition from simple modifications of nature to increasingly complex systems of control that begin to resemble true engineering. The moment trapping begins to require coordination beyond a single mind, it stops being just a technique and starts becoming a social system. Early humans cannot rely on individual skill alone anymore. The landscape has become something that must be prepared, watched, and activated by multiple people at once, often across distances where direct communication is impossible. What emerges is a quiet revolution in how groups organize themselves around survival. In this world, silence carries information. A figure standing at the edge of a valley is not just waiting, they are signaling readiness. Another figure further up the slope is not idle. They are holding position because movement too early would collapse the entire effort. Without words, without formal instruction, coordination develops through repeated shared experience, where timing becomes memory and memory becomes instinct. Trapping intensifies this dependence on synchronization. A pit alone is useless unless animals are guided toward it. A corridor of stones means nothing unless someone is positioned to drive movement through it. Even the most carefully prepared terrain remains dormant without human participation at the right moment. This transforms hunting from an individual act into a distributed process across space. The Ice Age environment reinforces this necessity. Visibility is often high across open plains, but distance is deceptive. Sound is swallowed by wind. Landmarks shift with snow accumulation. Even familiar terrain can become disorienting after storms. In such conditions, groups rely on prearranged spatial understanding rather than continuous communication. Each participant must know not only their role, but the roles of others. This is where trapping begins to shape social structure in subtle but lasting ways. Certain individuals become more familiar with terrain preparation. They learn where soil collapses more easily, where animal paths naturally converge, where wind hides human scent more effectively. Others develop stronger observational skills, tracking herd movement over longer periods. Some specialize in timing, waiting at critical points until conditions align. These roles are not formally assigned, but they become recognizable through repetition. Over time, trust becomes as important as skill. A trap only works if every participant holds their position until the correct moment. If one person acts too early, the entire system fails. This creates a pressure toward reliability that influences group cohesion. Those who consistently misjudge timing may be excluded from critical hunts. Those who demonstrate precision become essential. The landscape itself begins to function like a shared language. A narrow ridge may indicate a driving path. A specific bend in a valley may signal a waiting zone. A cluster of stones might mark a concealed hazard. These environmental cues are not universally standardized, but within groups, they develop meaning through repeated use. Archaeologically, this stage is almost invisible. There are no written records, no permanent symbolic systems. Yet patterns of repeated site modification suggest that certain locations were not just used, but understood collectively over time. Some kill sites show evidence of consistent directional movement of animals into confined spaces, implying coordinated driving behavior. One of the most significant consequences of this coordination is the reduction of risk during active hunting. Direct pursuit exposes individuals to injury, especially when targeting large or defensive animals. Trapping shifts much of this risk into preparation phases, where danger is lower but effort is higher. This redistribution of risk changes how groups perceive hunting as a whole. It becomes less about immediate confrontation and more about structured execution. However, this system is not without instability. Coordination depends heavily on environmental predictability. Sudden changes in weather can disrupt visibility and timing. Animals can alter routes unexpectedly. Even minor miscalculations in positioning can lead to complete failure. Because of this, early trapping remains a high-variance strategy capable of great success, but also frequent collapse. Despite this, its advantages are compelling enough that it spreads across different regions independently. There is no evidence of a single origin point for trapping behavior. Instead, similar strategies appear to emerge wherever environmental pressures make direct hunting increasingly inefficient. This suggests convergent cognitive development rather than cultural diffusion alone. In some regions, trapping techniques become more elaborate. Natural funnels are enhanced with human modifications. Stone lines are extended to guide movement over longer distances. Vegetation is cleared selectively to open or close pathways depending on seasonal migration patterns. These changes remain subtle enough not to alert animals too early, yet structured enough to influence large-scale movement. This marks a critical turning point. Humans are no longer just responding to animal behavior, they're shaping the conditions under which that behavior unfolds. The cognitive demands of such systems are significant. It requires holding a mental model of terrain, animal psychology, group positioning, and timing simultaneously. Even without formal abstraction, early humans are effectively performing complex spatial planning. Scholars often describe this as a foundational step toward later forms of engineering thinking. Still, it is important not to overstate the precision of these systems. They are fragile, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on environmental cooperation. Success often feels unpredictable even to those who designed the setup. A trap that works once may fail the next time under slightly different conditions. Yet this unpredictability does not discourage continued use. Instead, it encourages refinement. Each failure provides new information about animal behavior and environmental interaction. Each success confirms that partial control over nature is possible. And that possibility is enough to sustain the evolution of trapping systems. By the end of this stage, trapping is no longer an experimental curiosity. It is a recognized survival strategy embedded within group behavior, shaping how humans move through landscapes, interact with each other, and interpret the environment itself. The groundwork for more complex systems of control is now firmly in place, waiting for further cognitive and technological expansion. The first real transformation in trapping does not come from new materials or stronger tools, but from a deeper understanding of hesitation. Early humans begin to realize that the most predictable moment in any hunt is not the movement of prey, but the pause before movement. That fraction of uncertainty when an animal decides whether a path is safe or dangerous becomes the key point of control. In the Ice Age landscape, hesitation is everywhere. A herd reaches a narrow valley and slows. A single animal steps forward, then stops. Wind shifts across open ground and the group tightens instinctively. These micro-moments, almost invisible in isolation, are what determine whether a hunt succeeds or fails. Once recognized, they become the focus of increasingly deliberate manipulation. At this stage, trapping stops being about static structures alone. It becomes about guiding decisions. Early humans begin to shape not only where animals go, but how they feel about going there. This is not psychological control in a modern sense, but an observational understanding that fear and caution respond to environmental cues. A partially obstructed path feels more dangerous than an open one. A narrow corridor increases stress even before physical restriction occurs. These reactions are consistent enough to be used. So the landscape is adjusted with this in mind. A fallen tree is left in place not as an obstacle but as a psychological boundary. Stones are arranged in uneven clusters to create uncertainty rather than blockage. Even footprints and disturbances in soil are sometimes used unintentionally as guiding signals, influencing movement direction without overt intention. What emerges is a form of indirect behavioral engineering. This refinement changes the nature of trapping systems significantly. Earlier versions relied on physically restricting movement pits, barriers, and forced channels. Now, the emphasis shifts toward guiding animals into making predictable choices. The trap is no longer just a destination. It becomes a sequence of decisions leading toward that destination. Archaeological evidence for this stage remains extremely subtle. Physical structures alone cannot fully explain the patterns observed at certain prehistoric kill sites. In some locations, animals appear to have moved through areas that offer multiple escape routes but consistently favor one direction. This suggests that something more than physical obstruction may have influenced their movement. However, scholars remain cautious. Wind patterns, predator pressure, and herd dynamics can also produce similar outcomes. No single explanation fully accounts for all observed patterns. The evidence remains incomplete, but the consistency of directional movement in some contexts is difficult to ignore. Within human groups, this growing sophistication begins to influence status and expertise. Individuals who demonstrate a better understanding of animal hesitation become more valuable during preparation phases. Their ability to predict movement paths, even loosely, improves overall success rates. Over time, this leads to informal recognition of specialized knowledge, even if not formally defined. Cooperation also becomes more layered. Instead of simple roles like hunter or driver, participants begin to occupy positions in a spatial system. Some manage outer boundaries, ensuring animals do not escape early. Others position themselves near predicted convergence points. A few remain mobile, adjusting based on real-time movement. This dynamic structure requires constant adaptation rather than fixed roles. The cognitive load of such coordination is significant. It requires maintaining awareness of both immediate surroundings and anticipated movement patterns. Humans must think in terms of flow rather than fixed points. Where animals are now is less important than where they will be in moments of stress. This shift in thinking is crucial. It represents one of the earliest forms of dynamic spatial reasoning. Environmental manipulation also becomes more refined. Instead of large, obvious constructions, early humans begin using subtle modifications that blend into natural terrain. A slight narrowing of a path rather than a full blockage, a change in vegetation density rather than complete clearing, a repositioned stone that redirects rather than stops movement. The effectiveness of these techniques depends heavily on restraint. Over-modification leads to avoidance. Under-modification leads to failure. The most successful early trapping strategies are those that remain almost invisible until the moment of activation. At the same time, seasonal knowledge becomes increasingly important. Migration routes are not static. They shift based on climate conditions, predator pressure, and resource availability. Early humans begin to track these shifts over time, building a mental model of seasonal movement patterns. This allows traps to be placed not just in space, but in time. Timing becomes as important as structure. A trap set too early may be exposed and avoided. A trap set too late may miss the migration entirely. Successful hunting increasingly depends on aligning human preparation with animal rhythm. This introduces a new form of environmental dependence. Humans are no longer only reacting to the present landscape. They are anticipating future conditions based on past cycles. This is a significant cognitive expansion, even if it remains informal and experiential. Despite these advancements, trapping remains fragile. Weather events can disrupt carefully prepared sites. Unexpected animal behavior can bypass entire systems. Even successful designs must be rebuilt or adjusted repeatedly. Nothing is permanent. Yet this fragility is part of its evolutionary strength. Each failure refines understanding. Each success reinforces the principle that survival can be extended beyond immediate action. By the end of this stage, trapping has evolved into a system of guided decision-making across space and time. It is no longer just about capturing animals. It is about shaping the conditions under which capture becomes the most likely outcome. The foundation is now strong enough that more complex systems of structured environmental control will naturally follow. The most advanced early trapping systems do not appear as sudden inventions. They emerge quietly, layer by layer, as generations refine what earlier groups discovered through trial, error, and necessity. By this stage, trapping is no longer a set of isolated techniques scattered across Ice Age landscapes. It is becoming a recognizable strategy with internal logic, even if that logic is never formally expressed. The key shift is integration. Earlier methods focused on single elements, a pit here, a barrier there, a natural depression exploited when opportunity allowed. Now, these elements begin to work together as parts of a larger system. Movement is not just influenced at one point, but shaped across multiple stages. Animals are guided through a sequence of terrain choices that gradually reduce their options until escape becomes unlikely. This is where corridors, funnels, and controlled pathways become increasingly important. Early humans begin to enhance natural geography rather than replace it. A valley that already channels movement becomes more structured at its edges. A riverbank path is subtly reinforced to discourage deviation. A forest edge is partially cleared to create contrast between open and enclosed space, influencing how animals perceive safety and risk. None of these changes are extreme on their own, but together they create directional pressure. What matters most is continuity. A trap is no longer a single location. It is a connected sequence of influence across space. Archaeological traces of this stage remain difficult to identify with certainty. Organic barriers such as wood, brush, or woven materials rarely survive. What remains are indirect indicators, repeated animal movement patterns into constrained zones. Clusters of remains are lined along directional paths, and occasional stone arrangements that suggest intentional guidance rather than random placement. Some sites show particularly compelling patterns where animal remains are concentrated at the end of a narrow geographic corridors. These locations often lack obvious natural traps, suggesting that movement was influenced before animals reach the final kill zone. However, interpretation remains cautious, as natural herd behavior can sometimes produce similar clustering effects. Even so, the consistency of these patterns across different regions suggests that humans are increasingly shaping multi-stage hunting environments. This stage also introduces a deeper understanding of distance. Early trapping does not operate only at close range. Instead, it begins to manipulate animal movement from afar. Humans position themselves not just at the endpoint of a trap, but along its entire structure. Some individuals influence initial direction, others manage intermediate zones, others wait at final convergence points. This distributed presence transforms hunting into a spatial network of coordinated influence. The cognitive demands of this system are substantial. Each participant must understand not only their own position, but the expected movement of animals through multiple terrain stages. This requires mental simulation of motion under stress conditions. While not abstract in the modern sense, it represents a sophisticated form of environmental reasoning. At the same time, risk becomes more distributed. Instead of concentrating danger in a single confrontation, early humans spread it across the entire trapping process. This reduces exposure during the most dangerous moments, but increases time spent in preparation and waiting. The trade-off favors survival efficiency in environments where direct confrontation is increasingly costly. However, this system introduces new vulnerabilities. Because trapping relies on multi-stage coordination, failure at any point can collapse the entire sequence. If animals detect manipulation too early, they may abandon the route entirely. If timing is misaligned, the group may be too late to intercept. If environmental conditions change, carefully constructed pathways may become irrelevant overnight. Despite these weaknesses, the advantages continue to outweigh the costs in many regions, especially where large migratory herds provide seasonal opportunities. Even partial success yields significant returns. Over time, knowledge about these systems becomes more deeply embedded within group memory. Certain landscapes gain reputations as reliable interception zones. Seasonal timing patterns are remembered and anticipated. Generations learn not just where to hunt, but how to prepare landscapes in advance of animal arrival. This represents a profound shift in human-environment interaction. The landscape is no longer merely inhabited or traversed. It is actively organized in anticipation of future events. There is also growing evidence of adaptive learning within trapping systems. When one configuration fails, it is not simply abandoned, it is modified and tested again under different conditions. This iterative process suggests a form of experimental reasoning, even if informal. Early humans are effectively testing hypotheses about animal behavior through physical manipulation of their environment. The accumulation of these experiments leads to gradual refinement. Pathways become more efficient, corridors become more precise, concealment becomes more sophisticated. Over time, trapping systems evolve toward greater subtlety and reliability. Yet they never become fully stable or predictable. Even the most carefully designed system remains subject to uncertainty. Weather, animal adaptation, and environmental change constantly reshape outcomes. This instability ensures that trapping remains a skill of interpretation rather than absolute control. By the end of this stage, trapping has become a fully integrated survival strategy spanning space, time, and behavior. It is no longer an auxiliary method of hunting. It is a central framework through which early humans interact with the natural world. And from this point forward, the evolution of trapping begins to intersect with broader developments in human cognition, cooperation, and environmental transformation. The traces left behind by early trapping systems are not the kind of evidence that announces itself. They do not appear as intact structures or clearly defined machines. Instead, they survive as patterns in the soil, in the arrangement of bones, in the subtle geometry of repeated human presence across the same stretches of landscape. What remains is fragmentary, but when viewed collectively, it suggests something far more structured than simple opportunistic hunting. One of the most important archaeological signals comes from concentration. In certain prehistoric sites, animal remains are found not evenly distributed across a hunting zone, but clustered in specific areas that suggest constrained movement. These clusters often appear at the edges of natural features such as valleys, ravines, or narrowing river corridors. While such geography alone can influence animal behavior, the consistency of these concentrations across multiple sites raises deeper questions about human involvement. Another recurring pattern is repetition. Some locations show evidence of being used multiple times over extended periods. Soil disturbances suggest repeated digging or modification. Bone layers accumulate in structured ways rather than random scatter. These patterns imply that early humans returned to the same strategic points, possibly refining or reusing existing trapping setups. Yet interpretation is never straightforward. Natural processes can mimic human activity. Sediment shifts, animal scavenging, and seasonal flooding can all create misleading patterns. This is why scholars remain divided on how much of this evidence reflects intentional trap construction versus opportunistic hunting at naturally advantageous locations. The evidence points toward both possibilities, layered together over time. What is clear, however, is that hunting behavior becomes increasingly structured. At this stage, trapping systems are no longer isolated experiments. They are embedded within broader seasonal cycles of movement. Early humans are tracking migrations with growing precision, returning to known interception zones at specific times of year. This suggests a developing awareness of long-term ecological rhythm. The hunt is no longer only about immediate presence, but about anticipating future arrival. This temporal expansion is critical. It means survival strategies are now operating across months rather than moments. In practical terms, this requires planning. Groups must prepare landscapes in advance, sometimes long before animals arrive. This introduces risk, because prepared sites may degrade or become exposed. However, the potential reward is significant enough to justify the effort. A well-timed trapping system aligned with migration routes can provide food security far beyond what direct hunting alone can offer. At the same time, early humans are learning to manage uncertainty in more sophisticated ways. Instead of relying on a single trap or location, they begin to distribute effort across multiple potential sites. This redundancy increases the chance of success, even if one site fails due to environmental changes or animal avoidance. This diversification marks an important step towards strategic thinking in resource acquisition. Within groups, knowledge of these systems becomes increasingly valuable. Individuals who understand migration timing, terrain behavior, and animal response patterns gain influence in planning decisions. While no formal leadership structure is necessarily present, expertise begins to shape social dynamics more strongly. There is also evidence, though indirect, of knowledge transmission across generations. Younger members of groups likely learn trapping strategies through observation and participation rather than instruction. Over time, this creates continuity of practice, even as specific methods evolve. One of the most significant cognitive developments during this phase is the refinement of predictive modeling based on environmental cues. Early humans begin to associate subtle changes in weather, vegetation, and animal behavior with larger migration movements, a shift in wind patterns, a change in grazing behavior, or the timing of snowmelt becomes part of a broader interpretive system. This is not scientific prediction in a modern sense, but it reflects a growing ability to link multiple environmental signals into expectations about future events. Trapping systems benefit directly from this ability. The better humans can anticipate movement, the more effectively they can position themselves within the landscape before animals arrive. This reduces uncertainty and increases the efficiency of preparation efforts. However, the system remains fragile. Environmental variability continues to disrupt expectations. A delayed migration or an unexpected route change can render prepared traps ineffective. This forces continuous adaptation and reinforces the importance of flexible strategies rather than rigid designs. In some regions, evidence suggests that humans begin experimenting with layered trapping zones, areas where multiple guiding features overlap. These zones may include natural corridors enhanced with subtle modifications, secondary diversion paths, and final convergence points. The complexity of such systems indicates a growing sophistication in spatial reasoning, even if the methods remain simple in material form. Despite this sophistication, no evidence suggests full control over animal movement in the modern sense. Early humans influence probability, not certainty. Trapping increases likelihood of success but never guarantees it. This distinction is crucial for understanding the limits of early technological development. What emerges by the end of this stage is a mature but still evolving system of environmental manipulation. Trapping has become a reliable, though imperfect, component of survival strategy. It integrates observation, memory, cooperation, and timing into a single framework of action. And within this framework, the foundations of more complex forms of human-environment interaction are firmly established, setting the stage for further cognitive and technological expansion. At a certain point in its development, trapping stops looking like a set of human actions and starts looking like a relationship between humans, animals, and terrain. None of these elements dominate completely. Instead, each responds to the others in a constantly shifting balance shaped by climate, migration, and survival pressure. Early humans do not control this system in a strict sense. They learn how to operate within it with increasing precision. The most important development in this phase is divergence. As trapping strategies spread across different regions, they begin to evolve independently. Ice Age environments are not uniform. Some areas are open steppe with vast visibility. Others are forested, with limited sight lines and denser movement channels. River systems, mountain corridors, and coastal zones each impose different constraints on both animals and humans. As a result, trapping methods adapt locally rather than forming a single universal model. In open landscapes, long-range guidance becomes more important. Humans rely on distance-based coordination, using terrain features to channel movement across large areas before convergence. In forested environments, proximity matters more. Traps are shorter range, more concentrated, and often rely on sudden disruption rather than gradual guidance. In mountainous zones, elevation and natural funnels become critical. Each environment shapes its own version of trapping logic. This regional variation makes it difficult to define a single origin point for trapping as a technology. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of convergent evolution in human behavior. Different groups arrive at similar solutions independently because they face similar ecological pressures. Archaeological evidence supports this fragmented picture. Sites that appear to involve trapping-like behavior are distributed across wide geographic ranges, but they do not share identical structures or layouts. Instead, they reflect adaptation to local conditions. This diversity suggests innovation happening repeatedly rather than diffusion from one central source. However, despite regional differences, certain underlying principles remain consistent. Animals are guided rather than forced. Terrain is modified rather than fully constructed. Success depends on timing, concealment, and behavioral prediction. These shared principles point to a common cognitive foundation even if material expressions differ. Within this diversity, early humans also begin to develop more refined understanding of failure modes. A failed trap is not just an unsuccessful event, it becomes data. If animals avoid a modified corridor, the modification is too visible. If they scatter before entering a funnel, the guiding structure is too aggressive. If they pass through without hesitation, the system may be too subtle to have effect. This feedback loop gradually improves design sophistication. Even without formal experimentation, repeated cycles of construction and observation lead to increasingly effective strategies. At the same time, social structures continue to adapt. As trapping becomes more complex, the importance of experience increases. Individuals who have participated in multiple trapping cycles develop a deeper understanding of environmental responses. Their knowledge is often situational rather than abstract, but it becomes valuable during planning phases. This creates a subtle stratification of expertise, not based on power in a formal sense, but on familiarity with landscape behavior. Those who can read terrain effectively influence decisions about where and how traps are constructed. Another key development in this stage is risk anticipation. Early humans begin to account not only for animal behavior, but also for environmental unpredictability. Sudden weather shifts, unexpected herd movements, and seasonal anomalies are all factored into planning, even if imperfectly. This reflects a growing awareness that successful trapping depends on controlling variables beyond immediate perception. In some cases, this leads to redundancy in design. Multiple guiding paths may be prepared to account for different possible herd movements. Alternate interception points may be established in case primary routes fail. This increases labor investment but improves overall reliability. The archaeological record, while limited, occasionally shows evidence of such redundancy in spatial arrangements of prehistoric activity sites. Clusters of remains and tool usage areas sometimes appear in patterns that suggest fallback strategies rather than single-use locations. However, interpretation remains cautious due to the complexity of natural deposition processes. Despite increasing sophistication, trapping systems remain vulnerable to disruption. Animals continue to adapt. Herds learn to avoid repeated danger zones. Environmental change can render carefully prepared sites obsolete. This constant pressure ensures that trapping never becomes static. Instead, it evolves continuously. This dynamic interaction between human adaptation and animal response creates a long-term feedback loop that drives incremental innovation. Each improvement in trapping strategy is met with behavioral adjustment from prey species, which in turn forces further refinement. By this stage, trapping is no longer an isolated survival technique. It is part of a broader ecological interaction in which humans are active participants in shaping movement patterns across landscapes. This represents a significant shift in human ecological role from passive hunter to active modifier of animal behavior systems. Yet even with this shift, control remains partial. Humans influence outcomes but do not dictate them. Success is still probabilistic, dependent on countless variables that cannot be fully managed. And it is within this uncertainty that further innovation continues to emerge, pushing trapping systems toward greater integration and complexity in the next stages of development. At the edge of Ice Age survival, danger is never evenly distributed. It arrives in concentrated bursts during failed hunts, during exposure on open ground, during the moments when humans are closest to large prey but least protected. Early trapping systems begin to change this balance, not by removing danger, but by redistributing it across time and space. What once required direct confrontation now unfolds in stages separated by distance and preparation. This redistribution is subtle, but it fundamentally alters how risk is experienced. Instead of a single moment of violent encounter, survival depends on long sequences of coordinated action, most of which occur without immediate contact with animals at all. In this shift, trapping becomes more than a hunting method. It becomes a framework for managing uncertainty. The most advanced early systems begin to separate roles not only by function, but by exposure. Some individuals remain at distance, shaping movement patterns from safer positions. Others occupy intermediate zones where animals may pass but not yet be fully committed to capture paths. A final group waits at convergence points, where probability is highest but timing is critical. Each position carries different levels of risk and responsibility. This spatial layering of human presence across the landscape reflects a growing understanding of how movement can be structured over large areas. It is no longer enough to think of hunting as something that happens at a single location. Instead, it is understood as something that unfolds across an entire system of terrain interactions. In this system, failure becomes distributed as well. A mistake in one zone does not necessarily destroy the entire effort, but it can reduce efficiency or shift outcomes unpredictably. This encourages redundancy and flexibility in design. Multiple guiding routes, overlapping funnels, and alternative interception points become increasingly common in more complex trapping environments. Evidence for these systems remains indirect, but recurring archaeological patterns suggest that certain prehistoric sites were not single-use hunting locations. Instead, they appear to have been revisited and modified over time, possibly reflecting layered strategies of animal interception. The arrangement of remains and tools at these sites sometimes indicates structured movement through space rather than isolated kills. However, interpretation remains cautious. Natural processes can create misleading patterns, and without direct structural preservation, certainty is impossible. What can be said with confidence is that human activity in these zones was repeated, deliberate, and spatially organized. Another major development during this phase is the refinement of anticipation under uncertainty. Early humans begin to account not only for expected animal movement, but also for unexpected deviations. Herds may split, change direction, or respond to unseen predators. Weather may alter visibility or terrain stability. These variables force humans to think in terms of multiple possible outcomes rather than single expected results. This introduces a form of early scenario-based thinking. Trapping systems are adjusted to accommodate this uncertainty. Instead of relying on a single predicted path, humans prepare for several potential routes. Some pathways are subtly reinforced, others are left open but monitored. This increases complexity but improves resilience against unpredictable variation. At the same time, the role of experience becomes increasingly important. Individuals who have participated in multiple trapping cycles develop an intuitive sense of which conditions are favorable and which are not. This knowledge is difficult to express directly, but becomes evident in decision-making during preparation. Such expertise begins to shape group dynamics, not in rigid hierarchies, but in situational influence. Those with greater environmental familiarity are more likely to guide placement decisions, timing, and coordination strategies. There is also growing evidence, though indirect, of seasonal planning cycles tied to trapping success. Groups appear to return to certain landscapes at predictable intervals, likely aligned with migration patterns. These cycles suggest that trapping is not an isolated event but part of a broader annual rhythm of survival activity. This rhythm creates a deeper integration between human behavior and environmental cycles. Survival is no longer reactive alone. It is structured around anticipation of recurring natural events. Despite these advancements, the system remains inherently unstable. Animals continue to adapt their movement strategies. Some begin to avoid heavily modified areas altogether. Others alter migration timing or routes in response to pressure. This ongoing adaptation ensures that trapping remains a dynamic, constantly evolving practice. Humans respond in kind by adjusting concealment techniques, refining guiding structures, and exploring new terrain configurations. This interaction creates a long-term co-evolutionary process where neither side maintains permanent advantage. What emerges by the end of this stage is a highly flexible survival system built on layered understanding of terrain, behavior, and timing. It is no longer simply about capturing animals. It is about shaping conditions across multiple dimensions to increase the probability of success. And within this framework, the cognitive foundations of more advanced environmental control systems continue to deepen, preparing the way for even more structured forms of early engineering thinking. At a certain threshold of complexity, trapping stops being recognized as a collection of techniques and starts becoming a form of thinking about space itself. Early humans are no longer just reacting to terrain or modifying it in isolated ways. They begin to perceive landscapes as interconnected systems where every slope, corridor, and barrier influences movement across a wider network. This shift is subtle, but it is fundamental. Instead of asking where animals are, they begin to ask how animals move through space over time. The focus moves from location to flow, from static positions to dynamic pathways. In this stage, trapping systems become increasingly layered. A single hunting area is no longer defined by one guiding structure or one capture point. It consists of multiple interacting zones, each contributing to the overall outcome. Outer areas influence initial direction. Mid-zones refine movement. Inner zones determine final convergence. Even if no single part guarantees success, the combined system increases probability significantly. This layered approach reflects a deeper cognitive ability to hold multiple spatial relationships in mind simultaneously. Early humans are not calculating in abstract terms, but they are clearly capable of integrating complex environmental information into coordinated action plans. Archaeological interpretations of this stage remain cautious, but certain site distributions suggest repeated structured use of terrain that goes beyond simple opportunistic hunting. In some regions, clusters of activity appear arranged in ways that imply directional movement across landscape features rather than random encounter. While these patterns cannot confirm full trap systems, they are consistent with guided movement strategies. One of the most important developments in this phase is the refinement of environmental predictability. early humans begin to identify not just where animals travel, but how reliably certain routes are used under specific conditions. Seasonal changes, water availability, vegetation density, and predator presence all influence these routes. Over time, humans build increasingly detailed mental models of these dependencies. This knowledge allows for more precise preparation. Instead of broadly modifying terrain, humans begin targeting specific pressure points in animal movement systems. A narrow path that consistently channels herds becomes more carefully shaped. A river crossing that attracts seasonal migration becomes a focal point for coordinated effort. The emphasis shifts toward optimizing natural bottlenecks rather than creating artificial ones from scratch. At the same time, trapping systems become more temporally aware. Preparation is decoupled from execution by longer intervals. Humans may modify terrain long before animals arrive, trusting that environmental cycles will eventually bring prey into the prepared system. This introduces a new form of patience-based strategy, where success depends on aligning human action with ecological timing rather than immediate response. This temporal extension increases both efficiency and uncertainty. A well-prepared site may remain unused for extended periods if migration patterns shift. Conversely, sudden changes in animal behavior can create unexpected opportunities. Early humans must therefore balance long-term planning with adaptability. Another key development during this stage is the increasing sophistication of coordination across space. Individuals positioned at different points in the landscape must act in sequence rather than simultaneously. Timing becomes critical. A premature movement in one zone can collapse the entire structure, while delayed action in another can allow animals to escape. This requires an implicit understanding of shared temporal frameworks. Even without formal communication systems, groups develop reliable patterns of coordinated behavior based on repeated experience. These patterns are reinforced through success and corrected through failure. The psychological demands of this system are significant. Participants must maintain awareness of both immediate surroundings and anticipated movement across multiple zones. They must trust that others will act correctly without direct confirmation. This reliance on distributed coordination strengthens group cohesion while also increasing vulnerability to individual error. Over time, trapping systems begin to influence how space is mentally organized. Landscapes are no longer perceived as continuous, uniform environments. Instead, they are segmented into functional zones, areas of approach, areas of control, and areas of capture. This segmentation reflects a growing abstraction of space based on utility rather than appearance alone. Such cognitive restructuring represents a major step in human environmental reasoning. It allows for more efficient planning and more flexible adaptation to changing conditions. Despite these advances, trapping remains constrained by environmental unpredictability. Weather events can disrupt carefully structured systems. Animal behavior can deviate from expected patterns. Even successful strategies must be constantly adjusted to remain effective. This instability prevents trapping from becoming fully deterministic. Instead, it remains a probabilistic system shaped by continuous feedback between humans, animals, and environment. What emerges by the end of this stage is a mature spatial strategy system in which early humans actively organize large-scale movement patterns across landscapes. It is not control in the modern sense, but it is structured influence operating over time and space. And within this evolving framework, the conceptual foundations for more advanced forms of environmental manipulation continue to develop, setting the stage for the final transformation of trapping into a fully integrated survival technology. By this stage in the long evolution of trapping, the distinction between hunting and environmental management begins to blur. Early humans are no longer simply reacting to migrating herds or waiting for favorable encounters. They are actively shaping the conditions under which encounters become more likely, distributing influence across terrain in ways that extend far beyond a single moment of action. The landscape is now understood as a system of pressure points and movement channels. Certain valleys consistently funnel herds under seasonal conditions. Certain ridges act as boundaries that animals rarely cross unless forced. River crossings become predictable convergence points. Instead of treating these features as background geography, humans begin to treat them as functional components of a larger survival network. This shift transforms trapping into a form of long-term environmental engagement. Preparation becomes increasingly strategic. Early humans invest effort in modifying specific areas not for immediate use, but for future probability. A corridor might be subtly adjusted during one season in anticipation of migration patterns that will only peak months later. A cluster of obstacles might be arranged not to block movement entirely, but to delay and redirect it during critical periods. This delayed return strategy represents a major cognitive leap. It requires holding in mind not just present conditions, but future environmental states shaped by seasonal cycles, animal behavior, and landscape memory. While not abstract in the modern sense, it reflects a growing capacity for temporal projection. Archaeological interpretations of such behavior remain cautious, but repeated evidence of revisited sites and structured modifications suggests that certain locations were maintained over extended periods. These may not have been permanent installations, but they show signs of repeated investment and adjustment consistent with long-term use. In some regions, particularly where migratory herds dominate subsistence patterns, this system likely became especially important. Seasonal predictability of animal movement created opportunities for repeated preparation of known corridors. Over time, these corridors may have become central nodes in survival networks, linking multiple groups or subgroups across a shared landscape. Coordination at this stage becomes more sophisticated, though still informal. Instead of simple positioning, groups begin to operate with layered intent. Some individuals shape initial movement from distant points. Others control intermediate zones where animals are guided into narrowing pathways. A final group remains positioned at convergence points where capture probability is highest. This multi-stage involvement requires a shared understanding of timing and spatial structure that is reinforced through repeated practice. Even without formal systems of instruction, this coordination becomes increasingly reliable over generations. Knowledge is transmitted through participation, observation, and gradual refinement rather than explicit teaching. Another important development is the refinement of environmental prediction under variability. Early humans begin to account for not only expected seasonal cycles, but also deviations from those cycles. A delayed migration, an early thaw, or an unexpected storm can all alter the effectiveness of carefully prepared systems. As a result, trapping strategies become more flexible, incorporating multiple possible outcomes rather than relying on a single expected scenario. This flexibility is reflected in the design of trapping zones. Instead of a single guiding path, multiple alternative routes may be subtly prepared. Instead of one interception point, several potential convergence areas may be maintained. This redundancy increases resilience against environmental uncertainty, though it also requires greater labor investment. The psychological dimension of trapping also continues to evolve. Anticipation becomes a central feature of survival experience. Humans spend increasing amounts of time in preparation, waiting for conditions to align. This waiting is not passive, it is structured. informed by observation and expectation. Success is increasingly experienced as the culmination of extended processes rather than immediate action. This change in temporal experience influences how effort and reward are perceived. A successful trap represents not only a moment of capture, but the validation of extended environmental manipulation. Failure, conversely, reflects breakdowns in coordination, timing, or prediction rather than simple lack of physical ability. As trapping systems grow more complex, they begin to influence settlement patterns. Groups may return repeatedly to areas where trapping success has been historically high, reinforcing cycles of seasonal occupation. These patterns suggest an emerging link between environmental manipulation and spatial continuity in human habitation. However, these systems remain inherently unstable. No amount of planning can fully eliminate variability in animal behavior or environmental conditions. Herds continue to shift routes. Weather continues to reshape terrain. Predators continue to influence movement unpredictably. This ensures that trapping remains an adaptive process rather than a fixed technology. What distinguishes this stage from earlier forms is not control, but scale. Humans are now influencing movement patterns across larger areas and longer timescales than before. Trapping is no longer confined to immediate encounter zones. It is embedded within broader ecological rhythms. By the end of this phase, the foundations of integrated environmental manipulation are firmly established. The logic of guiding movement, anticipating behavior, and structuring space across time has become a core part of survival strategy. What remains is the final transformation, where these dispersed techniques begin to coalesce into more coherent systems of sustained environmental engineering, setting the stage for the emergence of far more advanced forms of human ecological interaction. In the final stage of this long development, trapping no longer appears as a collection of techniques or even as a coordinated strategy. It becomes something closer to an inherited way of thinking about the world. Early humans are no longer only adapting to landscapes shaped by nature. They are consistently interacting with landscapes that have been partially shaped by their own repeated interventions across generations. What began as occasional exploitation of natural depressions and accidental captures has now evolved into structured environmental familiarity. Certain valleys, corridors, and migration routes are no longer just known. They are repeatedly modified, revisited, and reinterpreted. Over time, these places accumulate layers of human intention, even if no single layer is permanent. The most important transformation in this stage is continuity across time. Earlier trapping systems depended on immediate coordination within a single event. Now, they depend on knowledge preserved across seasons and generations. A successful hunting corridor is not just used once. It is remembered, adjusted, and reactivated when conditions return. This creates a cycle in which human activity and animal migration begin to overlap in long-term rhythms. In some regions, this likely resulted in semi-permanent trapping zones. These were not fixed structures in the modern sense, but rather repeatedly maintained landscapes where human groups returned at predictable intervals. Over time, such locations would have become deeply embedded in survival strategies, functioning as recurring nodes in seasonal subsistence patterns. Archaeological evidence cannot fully confirm the permanence of these systems, but repeated site usage, clustered remains, and structured spatial patterns strongly suggest long-term engagement with specific environments. The difficulty lies in preservation. Organic materials decay, and shifting landscapes erase much of the physical record. What remains is fragmented, but consistent enough to support the idea of sustained environmental interaction. At the cognitive level, this stage represents a significant expansion of human environmental reasoning. Early humans are now operating with layered understanding immediate terrain conditions, seasonal cycles, animal behavioral patterns, and long-term landscape memory. These layers interact dynamically, allowing for increasingly flexible responses to changing conditions. Trapping, in this sense, becomes a form of ecological literacy. It requires understanding not only where animals are likely to move, but how entire ecosystems structure that movement over time. This includes vegetation cycles, water availability, predator pressure, and climatic variation. Each factor contributes to a shifting map of opportunity that must be continuously updated through observation. Socially, this creates a deepening reliance on shared experiential knowledge. No single individual can hold all relevant information. Instead, understanding is distributed across the group, accumulated through participation in repeated cycles of preparation, waiting, and outcome. This shared knowledge base allows groups to maintain continuity even as individual members change over time. The emotional experience of survival also shifts. Hunting is no longer defined by immediate confrontation. It becomes a long-duration process in which anticipation, preparation, and observation are as important as action. Success is measured not only in immediate returns, but in the ability to sustain cycles of interaction with the environment. Despite these advancements, uncertainty remains constant. No system fully eliminates unpredictability. Animals continue to adapt, sometimes altering migration routes or avoiding heavily modified areas. Environmental shifts can disrupt even the most carefully prepared systems. This ensures that trapping remains a dynamic practice rather than a static technology. Yet within this instability lies its strength. Because trapping is flexible, it can evolve alongside both environmental change and animal behavior. It does not rely on fixed structures, but on adaptable principles of movement, timing, and perception. By the end of this long evolutionary arc, trapping has become something more than survival technique. It has become a foundational expression of how early humans relate to the world around them. It represents the first sustained effort to organize external environments in anticipation of future events, linking memory, prediction, cooperation, and landscape into a single functional system. From the earliest accidental captures in natural terrain to the most refined, coordinated systems of guided movement, the progression reveals a continuous expansion of human cognitive engagement with space and time. And when viewed in this long perspective, the invention of the first hunting trap is not a single moment at all. It is a gradual awakening to the idea that survival does not depend only on reacting to nature, but on quietly shaping the conditions under which nature unfolds. As the Ice Age landscape fades into memory, what remains is not just the story of survival, but the slow emergence of awareness. Early humans do not suddenly become masters of their environment. Instead, they learn, step by step, that the world can be influenced long before it is directly encountered. A pit in frozen soil, a narrowed valley, a hidden path shaped not by force, but by patience. Each of these small actions carries the same quiet principle, that future outcomes can be guided by present choices. Across thousands of years, these decisions accumulate into something larger than hunting. They form the earliest outline of environmental thinking, where space is no longer passive and time is no longer separate from action. Everything becomes connected through anticipation. Nothing in this world is fully controlled. Weather still shifts without warning. Animals still change their routes. The land still erases human intention without hesitation. But within that uncertainty, early humans discover something: enduring influence does not require domination. It only requires understanding where movement begins and where it is most likely to end. And in that realization, the first hunting trap becomes more than a tool. It becomes a quiet reflection of a much larger transformation, one that continues in different forms long after the Ice Age has disappeared.